My name is Wright. I am the voice of reason. I speak for the Last Crusade. Every age has its peccadilloes. In the modern age, our most obvious is blatantly denying the obvious. We live in the era of the unreal. I can only offer as an observation what the passage of decades and the observation of the doings of modern men, from my viewpoint, first from a law office and later from the bullpen of a newspaper, have taught me. More proof than that is beyond my power to give. I can but point at the sight. You must look for yourself and see. What I observed is that modern men routinely would deny the undeniable, ignoring clear and evident dangers to life and liberty, while at the same time, and in the same spirit, cower and shriek like Chicken Little at utterly imaginary and unreal threats. One example of countless will illustrate. A modern man with a modern so-called education routinely is able to look at the evidence of thousands of terrorist murders, bombings, and beheadings inspired by the Islamic faith over decades, and then look at one act of violence from one semi-agnostic man with mental problems, and from his conduct conclude that Christianity is the real and serious threat. Each of the thousand acts of Islamic inspired terrorism, the modern, takes to be a solitary aberration or lone wolf, not related one to any other, and not representative of the whole of Islam. Any possible act of violence that can be attributed to a man who may or may not be Christian, however, is representative of the whole of Christianity, and sufficient grounds to condemn it root and branch. It only very slowly dawned on me what defined this kind of thinking. It is a loyalty to unreality as such. The devotee to unreality says he believes things that are obviously false, and denies things that are obviously true. And the more obvious it is, the more blatant, irrational, absurd, and mind-bogglingly stupid, nay, the more insolent these false affirmations and denials, the more loyalty is thereby publicly displayed by him, and the greater, in his mind, is his honor. To say that you believe UFOs are visitors from other worlds, or to say that you believe in ghosts, is no great honor. The evidence on those topics is obscure, and it tweaks no man's nose to say such things. But to say you believe a man, merely by so saying, can be a woman, and that society must treat him as a woman in all things from bathroom use to pronoun use, aha, that is truly unreal. That shows true loyalty to madness. I call it the unreality principle. It is the principle that it is meritorious to adore and serve the unreal on principle, regardless of context or consequences, that the more contrary to reality the unreality being adored and served may be, the greater the merit. The fact that the unreal is why it is sought out. It is more than just lying for the sake of lying. It is more than just insanity for the sake of insanity. The unreality principle is the rejection of reality for being real, the rejection of truth for being truth, the rejection of reason for being reasonable. This odd loyalty to unreality takes place on two levels, the philosophical and the practical. On the philosophical level, a man who is speaking on any deep issue will be debated and doubted, not about the debatable and doubtful conclusions he reaches, but on the self-evident, hence indubitable, first principles on which his and all thought is grounded. When a modern man with a so-called modern education, who would never think about denying any step of the complex chain of inferences and observations leading to a concept like quantum entanglement or anthropocentric global warming, will blatantly deny that male and female are different sexes. A man with a modern so-called education, to whom the legal reasoning behind the institution, such as a grand jury, or the practice of imposing penalties for perjury, is opaque, will nonetheless deem it a serious and profound legal question to ask what the meaning of is. Any questions pursued into the philosophical question of the nature of is will soon be swept into a swamp of pathless nonsense, as the modern so-called education teaches that there is no certainty, only probability, no truth, only opinion, no free will, only necessity, and no meaning to the life, universe, or anything, hence no meaning, most of all, to philosophical questions. Obviously, if we lived in such a universe, no debate and no disciplined thought on any topic would be possible. Imagine trying to do math in a universe where 2 is only an approximation of 2, and twice 2 was only probably 4. Saying the opposite sexes are also the same sex, or saying is not is, involves a paradox of speech beyond the level of a Zen koan. Each is merely a stark denial that reality is real. These doubts come not from liars, idiots, and fools, but from honest and so-called educated men who have been taught that it is ethically problematical and socially unacceptable to adhere to indubitable first principles. They were taught that morality and courtesy consist of speaking and thinking like venal morons and fools. As a result, modern conversations and debates end up with tedious predictability, shipwrecked on the same shoal. The so-called modern educated man makes a dishonest, idiotic, and foolish demand that the starting point of the debate, the point too obvious for debate, be debated. Typically, the demand is unspoken, for to deny the obvious in an obvious fashion would be obviously foolish. And so the modern so-called educated man does not say, "It is true there is no truth." Instead, he says, "Anyone who says he knows the truth is a fanatic and a danger to us all." Likewise, the modern so-called educated man does not say, "It is objectively true for all races of men and both sexes that their truths are subjective and relative to race and sex and hence differ." Instead, he says, "One cannot trust what the white male says." Likewise, again, the modern so-called educated man does not say, "I do not have free will, and thus these words I now seem to utter are merely the byproduct of a mechanical operation of moving voice box parts beyond my control." Instead, he says, "You do not have free will. Merely by being born white, you are the beneficiary of white privilege and hence are jointly and severally guilty of bigotry, of which you yourself were unaware and did not intend. The words you say are due to your genetic background and social cultural conditioning." Typically, these and other objections raised by the modern so-called educated man must include a point that he himself tacitly must admit even in order for his objection to be voiced. That is, for example, that words have meaning, or that truth is true, or that knowledge is known, or that a conclusion of fallacious reasoning does not necessarily follow. Obviously, the man who says that truth is not true and knowledge is unknown and logic is illogical cannot buttress such a statement with any evidence or reasoning, as he is simultaneously refuting what he asserts. But when the self-refutation is pointed out to him in a rebuttal, the modern so-called educated man ignores the point, changes the subject, or repeats his self-refuting statement as if it were a mystery of faith. Typically, he denounces the opposition as morally or mentally defective for daring to see the self-contradiction in his dogma. So the philosophers of the modern age find themselves in a kindergarten level of debate, explaining things to grown so-called educated men, which any schoolchild knows, things starkly, blatantly, and painfully obvious, such as that truth is true, logic is logical, and reality is real. Unfortunately, explaining the obvious is the most boring task to which the written word has ever been put, because everyone in the modern so-called educated audience knows the obvious whether he admits it or not. The speaker knows that the audience members know. The audience members know the speaker knows that they know. The whole thing's a charade without any point, and therefore even the pleasure of a game of charades is lost. Like the spines on a hedgehog or the stink of a skunk, the purpose of the demand for proof of the obvious is to fend off intruders. In this case, the intruder is anyone who wants to talk sense or hear evidence. The ritual of pretending not to know the obvious is not meant to spur conversation, but to deter it. Forcing all philosophical inquiries into the most boring channel of the stream of thought is precisely meant to run out of ground. It is meant to keep active and alert minds away from certain conversations, and to deter certain thoughts from being said aloud. If a man starts a conversation, let us say, on the topic of whether or not the President of the United States should or should not face impeachment for perjuring himself before a grand jury, this is a constitutional question, with legal and moral ramifications requiring sober concentration and rigorous attention. But if a skunk or a hedgehog can shift the conversation to the distasteful topic of whether the phrase sexual relation includes sodomy but not copulation, or the stupid topic of whether the word is refers to one act versus an ongoing series of acts, the jurors will be bored and disgusted, concentration will break, attention will ebb, the skunk has won. The only cost to the skunk is that he be soaked in stink. But if the skunk is of no character, cavorting with other skunks, he does not seek for his character to smell sweet. All human thought presupposes certain assumptions without which thought cannot exist. The belief that logic is arbitrary, for example, makes it logically impossible to affirm any conclusions necessarily implied by this belief. The chain of reasoning halts. You can still speak words, but they are jabberwocky, having no necessary relationship one to another. Such words no longer represent reality, and are no longer meant to do so. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe," has exactly as much meaning as, and as little as, is not. Contrariwise, to be fair, since Humpty Dumpty explains what some of the nonsense words mean to little Alice, perhaps Jabberwocky language is more rational, clear, and real than what comes out of the mouths and pens of modern so-called educated men. I chortle at the thought. On a practical level, the continual effort to shift any conversation about any real topic into an unreal conversation about nonsense and Jabberwocky is a way to maximize the psychological profit at minimal intellectual and personal cost. Any man smarter than another, or more eloquent, or more expert in a given field might overcome the case that other man is making in the courtroom of public opinion. Smart people are smarter than stupid people, such is the unfairness built into human nature. But if the other man, the stupid man, can shift the conversation into a topic where an inequality of intelligence or eloquence simply does not matter, then the playing field is level. So if an amateur is talking with a lawyer about the law, or talking with a philosopher about philosophy, all the amateur need do is shift the conversation to a topic more advantageous to him, and he does this by throwing a hysterical fit. He starts babbling about hallucinatory and imaginary fragments, flitting through the cavernous void and gloom of his brain. He rolls on the ground like a man possessed by unclean spirits, and he accuses his opponent of hurting his ever so very sensitive feelings. No mature woman, and no sane man of any age, would dare behave in this childish, silly, and manipulative way. But when a man of ordinary decency is having a polite conversation with a cruel and vindictive schoolgirl on the street, and she starts crying, screaming for the police, and holding out her shivering hands to the alarmed bystanders, our ordinary man is likely to drop the previous topic and say whatever soothing thing needs to be said, or offer any apology he needs to offer, merely to lower the pitch and volume of the clamor. The same principle also works in a conversation or public debate, where the topic can be shifted from the subject matter, where your intelligence or expertise might give you an advantage, to the question of whether you are guilty of problematic or inappropriate behavior by daring to discuss the subject matter. It is considered rude, for example, to have firm opinions on any controversial topic. The modern so-called educated man has been taught, as an ironclad principle to which there are no exceptions, that there are no ironclad principles. There is no exception to this rule. Modern education teaches that it is not merely rude, but an act of discrimination to have discriminating judgment and to detect the differences between good and evil. It is not evil to be evil, but it is evil to detect the differences between good and evil and to say good is better than evil. Modern education teaches that certainty is the source of evil. For without certainty, there can be no conflict of opinions, hence no tumults, revolutions, or wars. Modern man says certainty is evil. He is certain of it. Any man who supports the obvious will be accused. He will not be accused of some violation of an objective standard or clear rule known to all. He will be accused of trespassing on the tender feelings of someone unduly sensitive. Best of all, that someone unduly sensitive is usually theoretical and not present for cross-examination, such as members of a minority on whose behalf the accuser is bringing the accusation. You see, the state of mind, including the degree of your trespass in wounding the feelings of a purely hypothetical person not present in the conversation, is a matter where, being utterly unmoored from reality, everyone is equally an expert. I can say what a heffalump or a woozle or other imaginary creature might find offensive as equally as you can, or as Humpty Dumpty can, or as anyone else can. Because there are no rules and no standards in a conversation utterly divorced from reality. No umpire, no arbitrator, no restrictions, and I can say anything that pops into my head. The trouble of gathering facts and marshaling arguments therefore vanishes. Any idiot can now suddenly voice words as loudly as any expert. And discriminating between idiotic evil and sober experience has been ruled to be a hate crime, and out of bounds for the conversation. So when all conversations are turned into shouting matches, the one with the loudest argument, not the best, wins the prize. When you are accused of some crime that has a real and objective standard, you are in the position to bring proof and evidence to bear, and there are objective grounds for saying you did or did not violate the standard. But if you're accused of anti-heffalumpery or being called a woozlephobe, this crime is whatever the loudest and most hysterical voice in the conversation says it is. Because, keep in mind, as a decent man, all you are trying to do is pacify the crying and screaming hysteric, because the bystanders are looking at you askance and wondering what kind of monster would make the helpless cry. But as a zealot for unreality, the purpose of the hysteric is merely to derail the conversation. And if the only thing you can do to fend off accusations of being a member of the rape culture or of the patriarchy or of being a card-carrying beneficiary of imaginary white privileges is to silence yourself. And if you do not, you risk the anger of the mob who will silence you. That is the hope of the lying hysteric who is using your own decency against you. And it costs the hysteric nothing to ruin your reputation. The hysteric has no honor to lose. Whereas once ruined, the cost of rebuilding your honor and reputation is high, perhaps beyond reach. So this white blackmail, as so often described by Ayn Rand, is to use your own decency, courtesy, and reserve against you by persons who have none of these things, no decency, no courtesy, and no reserve, and they use them to hinder, trip, and wound you. Here is another advantage to the unreality principle. The screaming hysteric, when she makes her accusations, gets the most advantage for the least effort if she accuses you of her own flaws. If she is a liar, she calls you a liar. That way, if the truth ever comes out about her, any unwary onlookers will merely assume you and she are both liars. If she is motivated by hatred and malice, she will say that of you. That way, if any unwary onlooker stumbles across evidence making it clear that she is malicious, his own lazy sense of fairness will tempt him to believe you must also be malicious, at least a little, because you and she level the same accusations at each other. The idea that you are leveling a true accusation solely because it is true, and she is leveling a false one solely because it is false, is not likely to occur to a casual passerby. No one reading the newspaper about what a bigot and woozlephobe you are will care in the slightest whether or not you are innocent. Even the people who know the newspapers lie about other things will assume there must be some crumb of truth here because the average innocent person has never run across a cynically morbid form of perfect loyalty to unreality before. It is outside of their life experience. The unwary have never seen nor heard of someone who makes perfectly absurd and perfectly false accusations merely for the delight of falsehood out of a deep and pathological hatred of truth and reason. Such a state of mind is unimaginable to a sane person. Unimaginable, but alas, not inimitable. A man who is not perfectly psychotic and not a hysterical schoolgirl, when he finds himself floundering in some intellectual endeavor, could easily adopt the same sort of rhetorical tactic. He is not a monster himself, but he can act monstrous this one time or on this one topic. Instead of arguing the point when he's losing, he merely levels an accusation, usually a flaw he himself has, but his opponent does not, and then he stands on his dignity, if he has any dignity, or he drops into foul abusive language if he has not, until the opposition gets weary of the nonsense and walks away. At this point, having lost any semblance of an argument, the loser can declare himself to be the winner, and boast of this to his friends and allies. He can use this tactic without ever once raising his voice. It is a calm and soft version of the hysteric because it is emotional nonsense utterly divorced from reality, but it doesn't sound hysterical to onlookers. If his friends and allies pull the same rhetorical stunt whenever they're floundering in the deep end of the intellectual pool, their shared sense of guilt, their desire not to mar their mutual friendship, and their need for the company of like-minded persons snugly and safely hutched on the same low moral elevation will tempt them to commend rather than condemn his trick. One of several problems with this strategy of thought and speech is that honest conversation over honest disagreement is banished from the public square and private salon alike, and soon from every mind and heart. Each time one gives into the temptation to escape from criticism by escaping critical thinking, one's ability to think critically erodes. Disciplined thought requires discipline. Discipline that runs lax and flabby decays beyond recovery. It reaches a point where all questions, no matter how honest and no matter how sympathetic, sound to the lax and flabby ear like unprompted personal attacks, and a request to please show your work and to describe what steps in your thinking by which you came to a given conclusion stings like the slap of a glove in the lax and flabby face. Once a certain critical mass of thinkers in society has begun copying this hysterical, lax, and flabby method of rhetoric, that is, throwing a temper tantrum until the opposition is wearied into resting his case, this is taught in schools as the method to be used in thought and speech. After all, the scientific method teaches the student to be skeptical about any empirical matters not confirmed by experience and observation, so why not teach the student to be skeptical about the existence of reality? Perhaps reality does not exist. The fact that this stance of radical skepticism immediately contradicts itself is a fact of no concern to anyone loyal to a post-rational philosophy. The virgin purity of truth repels them. Their lust is gathered to the horror called propaganda, manipulation, and peer pressure, and all their desire is for the thought police. The upshot of this corruption, once it reaches from the schools to the law schools to the courts of law, is that even the wisest and most deeply learned minds in the land are not immune. When a Supreme Court justice can pen a sentence like this, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life," and not be laughed from public office, nor excommunicated from the Catholic Church, of which he claims to be a practicing member, the strategy of the hysterical schoolgirl has achieved final success. Unmoored from reality, liberty then must drift as a helpless nonentity in a blind fog, for the compass of the conscience is thrown overboard, and the sails of honor and honesty are torn, and the rudder of reason is gone. You cannot sail home after scuttling the ship. Likewise, you cannot reason yourself back to the truth from a stance that says all truth is relative and all reasoning is vain.